Comparative privacy frameworks are most useful when they are treated as lenses on the same landscape rather than rival maps competing for your attention. Your goal as a learner and practitioner is to understand the overlap and distinctions between SOC 2, ISO 27701, and HIPAA so you can design one coherent program instead of three parallel ones. Each model encodes familiar principles, notice, consent, rights, data minimization, but applies them in different scopes and with different forms of assurance. When you learn to align these principles across models, you can build a unified privacy posture that satisfies customers and regulators without multiplying effort. The payoff is fewer redundant audits, less evidence churn, and a clearer story for stakeholders. One set of controls, described once, reused many times. Think of it as creating a master score that different conductors can read without changing the music. SOC 2's privacy criteria bring privacy squarely into the trust services framework by asking whether your commitments about personal data are real, implemented, and consistently operated. The focus is practical. Do you provide notice, collect and use data with appropriate consent or other lawful bases, honor individual rights, and retain data only as long as necessary? These expectations are anchored in your system description, which defines boundaries, commitments, and the control environment. Assurance is delivered by a CPA firm under the ICPA's attestation standards, AT-205, which means the report expresses an opinion on the design and operating effectiveness of controls over a defined period. SOC 2, in this sense, is a mirror held up to your promises. It examines the criteria and your stated commitments and verifies whether reality matches the narrative you present. ISO 27701 approaches the same territory by extending ISO 27001 and 27002 into a Privacy Information Management System, or PIMS. Where SOC 2 speaks in criteria and attestation, ISO 27701 speaks in clauses, objectives, and controls you implement and continually improve. It maps explicitly to GDPR roles, distinguishing between obligations for controllers and processors, and expects you to integrate privacy objectives into the governance cycle you already run for information security. Certification rather than attestation is the mode of assurance. An accredited body evaluates conformity against the standard and issues a certificate if requirements are met. If ISO 27001 taught you to build a management system for security, ISO 27701 teaches you to tune that same system to the frequency of privacy, harmonizing policy, risk, and operations. Scope drives strategy, so appreciating the boundaries of each framework keeps you from over-engineering or under-protecting. SOC 2 applies to any service organization that makes commitments about how it handles data for customers. It's industry agnostic and adaptable to cloud-first realities. ISO 27701 targets global personal data governance, giving multinational organizations a common scaffolding that maps naturally to GDPR's worldview but travels well beyond Europe. HIPAA is intentionally limited. It governs PHI within the U.S. health ecosystem, yet its influence is outsized because of the sensitivity of the data it protects. Selecting frameworks based on data type and geography is practical. A SaaS platform with consumer data across regions may pair SOC 2 and ISO 27701. A healthcare clearinghouse processing claims will anchor on HIPAA and add SOC 2 for customer assurance. Control mapping is where efficiency comes alive. SOC 2 privacy criteria can be cross-referenced to ISO 27701's Annex A and B controls, revealing that practices like transparent notices, consent handling, rights response, and retention governance are shared expectations expressed in different dialects. HIPAA's administrative requirements and use and disclosure rules connect to these same themes and, together with the HIPAA security rule, align with SOC 2's security and privacy criteria. A working crosswalk shows which artifacts satisfy multiple tests: your DSR workflow, retention schedules, consent logs, DPIA equivalents, so you avoid reinventing evidence for every audit. Maintaining traceability across frameworks turns scattered policies and tickets into an integrated body of proof, making your control narrative portable and comprehensible across audiences. Evidence expectations differ in form but not in spirit. SOC relies on your management assertion and the auditor's testing results demonstrating the design and operating effectiveness of controls over a period. ISO 27701 expects evidence that your PIMS is established, implemented, maintained, and improved, policy trails, risk registers, objectives, and metrics that show a living management system. HIPAA compliance leans heavily on documentation of policies, procedures, notices, authorizations, and records of uses and disclosures, along with training and sanction logs. When you integrate your repositories, policy versions, tickets, logs, reports, you make artifacts discoverable and reusable. The same DSR ledger, for example, can serve as SOC2 evidence of rights handling, ISO 27701 proof of PIMS operations, and HIPAA support for accounting of disclosures. Understanding the line between regulatory mandate and market-driven assurance helps calibrate effort and urgency. SOC 2 and ISO certifications are voluntary in the legal sense, but often mandatory in commerce. Customers expect them as table stakes and may not sign without them. HIPAA, by contrast, is statutory. Covered entities and business associates must comply, with penalties for violations and breach reporting obligations that can trigger investigations. This divergence shapes your program. You may design SOC 2 and ISO 27701 to win and keep business, while you implement HIPAA to avoid legal exposure and to protect patients. Aligning the overall rigor with customer requirements means you neither overbuild for low-risk contexts nor underestimate the demands of regulated data. Language matters because it structures how teams think. SOC 2 uses categories and criteria, inviting a narrative around commitments and controls. ISO 27701 uses clauses, objectives, and controls, reflecting its management system DNA and the Plan, Do, Check, Act cadence. HIPAA speaks of administrative, technical, and physical safeguards, permitted uses and disclosures, and designated record sets, grounding expectations in legal constructs. Harmonizing these terms in your internal playbook prevents miscommunication. A DSR in SOC 2 or ISO becomes access, amendment, and accounting of disclosures in HIPAA. Retention schedule in SOC/ISO links to the 6-year documentation requirement under HIPAA. A glossary that translates across frameworks reduces friction and keeps stakeholders aligned. Assurance pathways also diverge, and planning for them avoids audit fatigue. SOC 2 requires an attestation by an independent CPA firm, typically producing a Type 2 report that covers operating effectiveness across months. ISO 27701 requires certification by an accredited body, often paired with ISO 2700 audits, with surveillance cycles and recertification every few years. HIPAA has no formal certification. Verification occurs through OCR investigations, internal assessments, or third-party reviews customers may request. Scheduling these activities so they feed one another, using ISO surveillance to refresh evidence, SOC 2 to attest the period, and HIPAA readiness reviews to harden controls, keeps efforts synchronized and scope optimized. The objective is one audit calendar, many audiences, shared artifacts. Risk assessment threads through all 3 frameworks, even if the stitching looks different. SOC 2's CC2 criteria and the privacy category expect you to identify, assess, and respond to privacy risks that could undermine commitments. ISO 27701 ties risk management into the broader ISO 2700 approach, integrating privacy risks into the same registers and treatment plans you use for security. HIPAA mandates a risk analysis and risk management process specific to PHI, emphasizing likelihood, impact, and the reasonableness of safeguards. Unifying templates and registers lets you capture once and report many times, linking risks to owners, mitigating controls, and tests. This is where a shared language of risk converts parallel frameworks into a single, navigable program. Breach and incident expectations align conceptually, but differ in specifics you must respect. SOC 2 expects documented incident processes aligned to your criteria and commitments, including timely detection, containment, and customer communication where promised. ISO 27701, building on ISO's incident management clauses, highlights notification expectations and the integration of privacy events into the same management system you use for security incidents. HIPAA is precise. Most breaches of unsecured PHI trigger notifications to affected individuals, HHS, and sometimes the media within 60 days, with careful documentation of risk assessment and mitigation. Centralizing your playbooks, who decides, who signs, who informs, ensures one response engine can satisfy the strictest rule while covering the others by design. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Rights management is where theoretical commitments become lived experience for individuals, so a unified response process matters more than any single framework's wording. In a SOC 2 context, you operationalize data subject requests (DSRs) as part of contractual promises and documented criteria. Intake channels are clear, identity verification prevents inadvertent disclosure, and ticket workflows measure responsiveness. ISO 27701 expects the same outcomes but anchors them in PIMS procedures for access, rectification, and erasure, distinguishing controller versus processor obligations. HIPAA's analog is access, amendment, and accounting of disclosures for PHI, each with specific timelines and permissible denials. The practical solution is one orchestration playbook, a consolidated portal for requests, common identity proofing, a shared case record, and branching steps that apply HIPAA rules when FI is involved and ISO SOC language when broader personal data is in scope. Retention and disposal policies feel abstract until you must reconcile conflicting rules, which is why aligning to the strictest applicable requirement brings clarity. SOC 2 asks that retention match explicit commitments and stated purposes, supported by lifecycle automation and auditable destruction. ISO 27701 treats retention as a managed control policy-driven, risk-based, and demonstrably enforced through the PIMS cycle. HIPAA adds a firm anchor. Many designated record set documents and required policies must be kept at least 6 years, shaping how long you retain proofs of notices, authorizations, and disclosures. A unified schedule catalogs categories, purposes, legal hooks, and minimum periods, while tooling enforces deletion after final dates. When exceptions arise, litigation holds, regulatory requests, documented overrides pause the clock without undermining the integrity of the overall discipline. Training and awareness requirements converge on the idea that privacy is a daily habit, not a quarterly audit sprint. All three frameworks expect role-based education that reaches engineers who design data flows, marketers who manage consent, support agents who handle identity checks, and executives who approve risk trade-offs. A global program addresses jurisdictional nuances, HIPAA scenarios for PHI handlers, GDPR concepts for EEA-facing teams, and platform-agnostic principles for everyone. Completion tracking is necessary but insufficient. Incorporate comprehension checks, scenario walkthroughs, and tabletop exercises that simulate DSR surges or breach notifications across borders. Tie outcomes to audit metrics, reduced processing errors, faster request fulfillment to show that learning changes behavior. Training thus becomes an operational control, not a ceremonial checkbox. Cross-border data transfers highlight philosophical differences that can still harmonize operationally. In SOC 2, you document where data resides and how transfers are governed in the system description and contracts. ISO expects structured transfer assessments, appropriate safeguards, and evidence that controls travel with the standard contractual clauses, risk evaluations, and vendor assurances. HIPAA, while U.S.-centric, restricts disclosures of PHI without authorization and imposes its own conditions on sharing with business associates regardless of geography. A unified policy names permitted transfer mechanisms, assigns responsibility for assessments, and centralizes records of decisions and safeguards. The workflow starts with purpose and role, controller/processor, checks lawful basis or authorization, selects an appropriate mechanism, and logs the rationale. Once captured, it covers SOC 2 narratives, satisfies ISO artifacts, and keeps HIPAA disclosures traceable. A maturity map across frameworks helps you diagnose where you are and chart what to fix next. At Level 1, audits are siloed. Separate policies, duplicative evidence, and frantic data calls before each review. Level 2 introduces an integrated crosswalk, one repository, shared artifacts, and mapped controls that serve SOC 2, ISO 27701, and HIPAA simultaneously. Level 3 is unified assurance, dashboards that show control health across standards, automated evidence collection, and near real-time readiness. Progress is visible in reduced time to audit, fewer exceptions, and clearer accountability. The journey is not about accumulating badges. It is about converting privacy from episodic compliance into an always-on operating model where evidence is generated as a byproduct of doing the right thing. Common pitfalls typically trace back to language, duplication, and diffusion of responsibility. Documents describe the same process in different terms, causing reviewers to question whether 3 processes exist or one inconsistent one. Teams run redundant tests for separate audits because no one trusts the crosswalk or evidence inventory. Ownership is fragmented. Security owns encryption, legal owns notices, product owns telemetry, so gaps form in the seams. The antidotes are straightforward: a shared glossary translating SOC 2, ISO, and HIPAA terms, a single evidence calendar with authoritative sources, and a RACI that names one accountable owner for each privacy outcome. Governance integration and shared tooling transform accidental complexity into deliberate simplicity. Strategic alignment yields benefits far beyond audit efficiency. When you present a coherent privacy story, controls that work across frameworks, evidence that speaks multiple dialects, you shorten customer due diligence cycles and build trust faster. Risk visibility improves as you compare data types across systems, vendors, and regions with common metrics. A single source of truth reduces internal debate and accelerates decisions, while external messaging gains credibility. You are not merely compliant, you are transparent and predictable. In competitive markets, that reliability becomes differentiation. Prospects feel they can forecast your behavior under stress, which is another way of saying they are willing to stake their reputation on yours. For multi-framework audits, clarity about evidence pays compounding dividends. Start with a crosswalk matrix that maps SOC 2 privacy criteria to ISO 27701 clauses and HIPAA provisions relevant to your scope. Populate it with living artifacts: DSR logs, DPIA records or their risk assessment equivalents, training rosters, breach notification samples, retention schedules, and vendor attestations. Keep links to underlying tickets, configurations, and reports along with the period of coverage and the control owner. Invite auditors to sample directly from this source, which reduces bespoke uploads and ensures everyone tests from the same ground truth. Over time, the matrix becomes institutional memory, surviving reorgs and platform migrations. Reporting integration is where narrative discipline meets version control. Each framework has its own deliverable: SOC 2 reports, ISO certificates with statements of applicability, and HIPAA assessment summaries or OCR correspondences. But contradictions between them erode credibility. Maintain a single findings register. Tag each item to the frameworks it touches, and propagate consistent remediation narratives across outputs. Use controlled templates that reference the same evidence IDs and periods. Before publication, convene a governance review that includes privacy, security, legal, and product to catch divergences. The aim is not to sanitize reality, but to ensure that different reports portray the same reality with compatible vocabulary. Customer communication turns internal assurance into external confidence. Explain plainly which frameworks you cover, which regions or business units they apply to, and how customers can verify claims through trust portals, requestable summaries, or dedicated calls. Provide attestation snapshots and certification details without oversharing sensitive artifacts. Keep FAQs updated for recurring assurance questions like data location, subprocessor changes, and DSR timelines. Transparency does not mean indiscriminate disclosure. It means giving customers the information they need to make informed decisions, delivered consistently and kept current as your posture evolves. Rights management at scale benefits from thoughtful tooling, but technology enablement must serve policy, not replace it. A consent management platform synchronizes preferences across properties. Data discovery tools locate personal data for deletion or access. Workflow engines orchestrate DSRs with identity proofing and deadline tracking, and logging systems make each action audit-ready. Connect these tools with APIs so that evidence consent changelogs, deletion confirmations, notification records flows into your assurance repository without manual handling. By designing the data model once and automating the pipelines, you reduce error rates and free human attention for exceptions that genuinely require judgment. Metrics keep leaders focused and teams honest, so choose measures that reflect outcomes rather than activity. Track DSR fulfillment time distributions, not just averages, to surface tail risks. Measure DPIA completion rates against a denominator of eligible projects to avoid vanity numbers. Monitor complaint volume per 1,000 users and correlate with product changes or policy updates. For HIPAA scope operations, watch accounting of disclosures timeliness and authorization defect rates. For global operations, monitor transfer assessment coverage and renewal cycles. Publish these metrics internally, pair them with owners and thresholds, and review them with the same cadence as reliability and security KPIs, integrity through repetition. In conclusion, comparing SOC 2, ISO 27701, and HIPAA is not an academic exercise. It is a blueprint for building one privacy engine that powers many forms of assurance. The distinctions are real: attestation versus certification, sector law versus voluntary frameworks, criteria versus clauses. But the operational spine is shared: notice and transparency, lawful bases and authorization, rights response, retention discipline, vendor governance, incident readiness, and evidence that speaks for itself. By unifying governance, harmonizing terminology, and reusing artifacts through a maintained crosswalk, you reduce complexity while raising confidence. Do this well, and privacy becomes both a lived ethic and a durable operating capability, ready for the next audit, the next jurisdiction, and the next question from a customer who needs proof, not promises.